Welcome to this evening's meeting of the Workers' International Network. Tonight's subject is America. There's some cataclysmic events going on in America. We've got John Ryman here from California. He's a member of Oakland Socialist, and he's going to lead off on events in America. I'm just trying to spot you at the moment, John. Where is he? Right, hi John, are you there? How long would you like to talk for, John? You need to unmute yourself. Turn your mute off.
Well, I would like to talk for 3 or 4 hours, if that's okay.
No.
I'm thinking it'd probably be about 20 minutes,
Okay.
25 minutes. Is that okay?
Can you see my ingenious note? It says on it 5 minutes left. If I hold that up when you've got 5 minutes left, will you see it okay?
Yeah.
If I wave the piece of paper at you.
I'll probably be, I won't really see your sign. Well, maybe.
You might, yeah.
I'll try not to see it.
You'll try not to see it. Well, if you don't react to it, so I'll try some other way.
Yeah, it's okay. Or just, you could just break in and comment.
All right. Just before John starts, just a bit of housekeeping. Please can everybody keep the microphones on mute if they're not actually speaking, because it can be very distracting if we can hear your household background noise. And if you later on in the discussion you want to put your hand up, it's a good idea to use the little electronic hand, because I'm looking at 2 screens at the same time and I may not see you otherwise, or put a message in the chat, I'll see that. So without further ado, John, would you like to kick off?
Okay, thank you. Well, I should also just complete my introduction by saying once again that I'm also a member of the Workers' International Network. And the election of Donald Trump came as a shock to many, and including myself, and also the fact that the capitalist class, after he came into office, that they were unable to get him in line, to get control of him, was also quite stunning, at least for me. And for me, that meant that we have to look at what's happening in the United States and in fact in the world through fresh eyes. And you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and abandon the Marxist approach, but we have to reconsider what's been happening in this country a little bit differently from how many of us had viewed things up until now. And we've come through and are still in a confused and confusing a period without precedent in the history of capitalism. The globalization means the demise of the nation states. You've had capital and also human beings flooding from one part of the world to another, something like passengers on a ship, flooding from one side of the ship to another and rocking the ship back and forth, nearly sinking it. That's on the one side. You've had the degeneration and the fragmentation of the U.S. capitalist class, with the partly due to the domination of finance capital and their almost exclusive focus on next quarter's profits, rather than a strategy for capitalism further into the future. Also, with the absence of the Soviet Union and also by and large the absence of the working class as any sort of independent force in society, that those two forces in the past had kind of served to discipline the capitalist class and helped to hold it together. And that the Soviet Union has disappeared, of course, and the working class as an independent force has been weakened. This whole period has also led to enormous confusions in the working class and something of a fragmentation of the working class in the United States. You have the confusion that's been compounded by a 75-year war of the union leadership against those who sought to maintain the fighting and also the socialist traditions of a previous era. And this has opened up the space for a more reactionary layer of workers. In many cases, it's actually that layer of the workers that moved into the leadership of the unions. That's certainly been true in my former union, the Carpenters Union. And as a footnote, I should add that the confusion and retreat of the working class was mirrored 1,000 times over in the socialist movement. And the result of all of this, both the objective conditions as well as the subjective ones, has been a steady string of defeats, one after another for the workers. And yes, there have been some defensive battles, but nothing on the scale of what was required, even on the economic front, no less on the political front, where any kind of serious political struggle would have had to have moved in the direction of fighting for an alternative, of organizing for an alternative to the Democratic Party. And whereas it's demoralizing to lose after a battle, it's even more demoralizing to lose without a battle. And in the political arena, as I said, there was no battle to speak of. And I should just mention again, at the last meeting, we had something of a disagreement of the role of people like Jane McAlevey, and by implication, similar ones. And there is not one iota of difference on as far as McAlevey and people like that, not one iota of difference between her and the rest of the union bureaucracy on this absolutely central issue of the need for a working class party. So in the absence of all of that, then millions of US workers fell backwards. And if you look at some voting statistics from 2016 elections, one study said that during the primaries in 2016, that of those voters who planned to vote for Trump in the primaries, 55% identified themselves as working class. And in the general election, 39% of union members voted for Trump. And amongst white union members, it was 52%. So, of course, there has been some resistance and very significant resistance to what's happened. But we should look at that resistance, yes, with enthusiasm, but also with a critical eye. And the most notable on the one hand, you have Bernie Sanders. And the only way to understand his role is to see that the key to capitalist stability in the United States is their monopoly in US politics. And that monopoly can only be opposed through the building of a working class political party. And I'm intentionally saying working class, not a socialist political party, because it's that class basis that is really what is central. And I repeat what I've said many times before, that the progressive wing of the Democrats, which Bernie Sanders has been the foremost representative of, has been absolutely indispensable in diverting any tendency of struggle away from political independence, and in luring any tendency for struggle back into the Democratic Party. We've seen that time and time again, and that was in fact the main effect of the role of Sanders, and is now unequivocally clear, but it was entirely predictable, and in fact it was predicted in advance. And that, and it's true that he caused some headaches and popularized certain reforms, but that is just simply the cost of doing business. And the more important issue, which is maintaining capitalist political monopoly, and in that, his role and the role of others like him has been indispensable. Now, and linked with that is the role in diverting any anger or objections away from mobilizing in the streets. And the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, of which Sanders is part, they played an important role in that too, on one issue after another: the government shutdown, confirmation of Kavanaugh, and on like that. Now, as far as the Black Lives Matter movement, that has been really inspirational in a lot of ways. And the enthusiasm for it is entirely justified. You've had, I think it was like 1 million or 2 people protesting in every state in the country, in towns and cities large and small. And it helped millions of white Americans get a clearer view of the institutional nature of racism in the United States, especially, but not only in the police. And we must not underestimate the importance of that, but we also have to see the shortcomings of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that movement has exhibited a clear tendency to see the issue of police brutality and police murders and the entire law enforcement system as being purely a matter of racism. And of course, racism is a fundamental and central part, but is only part of the role of the police, including their brutality and murders in general. And so, for instance, you had a couple of weeks ago, the police execution of this guy, Michael Ronhold. He was the guy who up in Portland shot and killed one of the Proud Boys, who he said he did it in self-defense. And what happened? A group of police, local, state, and also federal law enforcement tracked him down, and they just simply enacted an outright execution, broad daylight out in the streets. Now, and if there ever should have been a mass protest across the country over police murders and executions, that is one. And what happened? There was 1 or 2 protests, I think, in Portland, and that was the end of it, because that murder did not fit into the narrative of the general movement. And it's been similar that other issues have been ignored. The end of the $600 a week unemployment supplement. I think there was 1 protest in the entire country over that. The spread of COVID-19 in Black and Latino communities and in meatpacking plants. There have been a series of strikes over that, but the broader social movement has not taken that up. And what was needed, in other words, was a general program, not just in words, but as an active organizing tool, and also to build an organization around that program, complete with democratic structures. So, so overall, obviously, just to sum up, it's been an enormously positive development, but we have to recognize those weaknesses. And I think it's something similar for the Me Too movement, which enormously raised the consciousness about sexual harassment, especially at work. But it too exhibited similar weaknesses. And we are now, I think, almost certainly going to see a Supreme Court that overturns the Roe versus Wade decision, which outlawed, which made it impossible, made it illegal for states to outlaw abortion. I think that the new Supreme Court will probably reverse that decision. So overall, because these movements have not taken a clear class stand, and because they were unable to raise the issue of class politics and unable to clearly confront the issue of the capitalist monopoly on politics and the role of the Democratic Party. And therefore, there's a popular narrative in the United States that goes something like this. You can go out and protest all you like, that's important. But at the end of the day, if you don't vote, it's all useless. If you don't vote, don't complain. And in practice, what that means is if you don't vote for the Democrats, or at least support the progressive wing of the Democrats, then it's all useless. And that narrative can only be countered by posing a clear alternative and working to build a clear alternative, which is a working class party. Now, as far as the role of the unions, some dismiss the unions because they're only 10% of the working class, but that's still 14.6 million workers. There's no left group or series of left groups that it can even begin to compare to that. And even that underestimates the potential power for the unions, which control most of the key sectors of the US economy: transportation, utilities, industrial production, and they're also concentrated in the major major urban centers. But again, the role of the leadership has led to massive alienation on the part of the membership. And so these are the key factors in considering the future of a movement against the attacks of capitalism. Now, the question was raised, and it's been discussed here considerably in the United States, of the possibility of a constitutional crisis following the elections. And that would flow from two main sources. One is the confusions built into the US electoral system of how the president is elected through the Electoral College. And the other, which compounds the first, is the delay in the counting of mail-in votes. And to understand that, we have to look at a little bit of legal history. And you know, as Marx said, that law is a recognition of accomplished fact. And as the American dream ended, both parties, but especially the Republicans, resorted to dog whistles for racism, and also on the part of the Republicans, more overtly xenophobia and chauvinism. And the Republicans tried to balance that with appeals to Black voters on the grounds that you too can become a successful entrepreneur. But it was never possible to balance those two, more overt racism with appeals to Black voters. As one former mainstream conservative Republican put it, you feed the crocodiles are going to come to eat you eventually. And so in 2005, they reinstituted, they passed once again the voting rights law, or the civil rights law that had been passed in 1968. And for one thing, what that law did was it made it extremely difficult for those states who had practiced Jim Crow to change their voting laws. But what it didn't do, all this while, you had continual gerrymandering to minimize the impact, the effect of Black voters in congressional elections. And this was done through redistricting from the 2010 census. So the result, by 2010, you had 20% of the population living in states where the Democrats got a majority of the votes, but one or both houses of the state government was controlled by Republicans. And something similar was developing at the national level. So you had the same in 2012. In those elections, which Obama won, and the Democratic congressional candidates won 1.4 million more votes than the Republican candidates, but the Republicans gained control over the House. And I want to emphasize that this gerrymandering strategy was only possible due to the decline in class consciousness, meaning especially that white workers increasingly saw themselves as white and Americans rather than as part of the working class. So at the same time, you saw the rise to power in 2012 of the Tea Party Republicans, who no longer felt bound by the old deals that were made between the Republican and Democratic parties. And all of this was warning signs of a weakening of the, quote, democratic firewalls that kept the crocodile from getting bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. And one side effect, or one effect of the election of Obama, gave credibility to the illusion that we're living in a post-racial, I don't see that, Pam, that we're living in a post-racial society. And the Supreme Court in 2013 then struck down key sectors of the Civil Rights Act. And that led to a flood of new voter restrictions. From 2014 to 18, over 32 million voters were purged from the rolls. So all of this then there was also the end of a consent decree, which stopped the Republicans from mobilizing to repress voters on voting day. And as Donald Trump put it, we're going to have sheriffs and we're going to have law enforcement and we're going to have hopefully U.S. attorneys at the polls. They're also planning to have the Proud Boys and so on. So the other major source was this so-called blue tide. And what that means is that it takes a lot longer to count mail-in votes than the in-person votes. And whereas in the past we were used to always on election day the winner is declared, now increasingly the one who won the in-person votes, it might not be the one who wins the votes overall because of the delay in mail-in votes. And almost inevitably that means that the Democrat will overtake the Republican. And so there's all kinds of plans to have masses of people swarm the places where they're counting the mail-in votes and make it nearly impossible. In year 2000, you had the Brooks Brothers riots in Florida. Something similar, but on a more massive and threatening scale is what's planned. And so what may happen is that the dates that are set in the Constitution and in law, when the electoral votes have to be gathered and counted and officially confirmed, that they might not be able to reach those dates. So that's all based on the possibility that the vote would be quite close and that Trump could win on election night, but then that victory would be overcome later on when the mail-in votes are counted. Now, at this time, it's starting to look like Trump might even lose on election night, in which case there will be a lot of furor and shouting and crying and other stuff, but this constitutional crisis or possible constitutional crisis, I think will be most likely averted. But one thing that we have to learn is that we really don't know what's going to happen. And I want to emphasize that also that while the capitalist class may be fragmented, it's not entirely fragmented. And the major sectors still have a world vision, neoliberalism, world production, world markets, maintain control by bourgeois democracy, and maintain the system of alliances, first and foremost, the Atlantic Alliance as represented by NATO. And they are horrified by what Trump has done to shatter all of this, partly because of what's happened to the US, quote, leadership on a world scale, and also partly because he has enormously increased the divisions in US society and destabilized US politics. He's also increased the hysterical science denialism and so on. And the capital bourgeois democracy needs certain recognition of science in order to rule with stability. If you don't mind, I'd like to take another 5 minutes. There's been this unrelenting propaganda campaign on all the media outlets against Trump, with the exception of Fox. And it's very significant that despite that, Trump still has slightly over 40% approval ratings. And you should compare that to Nixon, whose approval ratings were 24%. So even despite the opposition of the mainstream of the capitalist class, well, I'll say it really shows the weakness of the mainstream of the capitalist class, the weakness of their base in society as a whole. And as I said, it's looking somewhat more possible that a landslide Biden victory would happen, in which case this kind of constitutional crisis would be almost certainly averted. But the Proud Boys and these other groups, some of them will be demoralized, but that demoralization could also take the form of widespread terrorist attacks. Now, as far as some other points, I've been calling for turning to the labor movement and trying to encourage an organized opposition to be built within the labor movement to mobilize workers to counter both Trump's anti-democratic attacks and also the far right. And it's interesting to see that there have been over 1,100 strikes since March 1st, many of them around the issue of COVID and workplace safety, initiated from below by the workers themselves. And it could be, if that were generalized and brought together, that could be the beginnings of the basis for a working class political party, but which would not start in the electoral arena, but as a body that organizes the working class and helps lead it forward. So as far as, and incidentally, you've seen a couple of official labor bodies, including the Rochester Labor Council, now calling for a general strike in the case of a Trump coup. So just in conclusion, some points as far as the perspectives for a Biden presidency, which I think would be an extremely weak presidency. He has very little enthusiasm, even amongst his supporters to start with. He would be coming into office, his first task would be to try to resolve the COVID-19 crisis. But that can't be resolved unless and until a vaccine is developed, which would be long-term effective. And that's not even certain that can happen. Even his reforms that he would try to institute would be very difficult, because the Republicans have left a poison pill in the form of a Supreme Court, and that will rule as unconstitutional almost any reforms that he and the Democrats try to pass. And don't forget also that there's a long history of the Democrats relying on the Republicans to prevent any serious reforms. But anything that does get through, then there will be a huge turmoil around the role of the Supreme Court. And so this return to normalcy, it might be possible for a short time, but only a very short time.
Can you wind up, John? Can you just wind up?
One final question.
Yeah, you'll be able to come back to this later, but go on, last question.
Okay, and that is, I referred to the fragmentation of the capitalist class. And is it possible that a wing of the capitalist class, that wing of the capitalist class can become dominant? And if so, what result? If it becomes dominant, what Roger once called the lumpenized sector of the capitalist class, then it seems to me it would not be able to control the president at all. And doesn't that mean the coming into power of one-person dictatorship, also known as Bonapartism? And I think this is a question not just for the United States, but this is also part of a global process.
Okay, that's great, John. Thank you very much for that very interesting introduction. I'm just seeing who's. I'll open the meeting to discussion now. We'll see how it goes. If a lot of people ask questions, we could perhaps come back to you periodically, John. But just having a look now who wants to speak. Right, Finn, could you come in, please?
I want to thank John for his contribution, particularly the references to the recent activity on the trade union front. Just an example, in John's own pamphlet, What Happened to Our Unions? He mentions that Peter Maguire, the founder of the Carpenters Union, was a socialist. And it's in that vein I want to make my remarks. Irrespective of what Trump does, irrespective of the Supreme Court, irrespective of the postal difficulties in elections, irrespective of all of that, nothing can prevent mobilization of the American working class, their arousal into class consciousness, and their ability and absolutely inevitability of taking on the system. Now, we can't predict the timescale, but that cannot be stopped. And the process won't happen in a single leap. It'll be a series of advances. Now, the objective situation would drive that. Not the maneuvering of the union leaders, not the maneuverings of Trump, but the objective situation in terms of employment and wages. 47 hours a week is the average working week of American workers. And 40% of workers have a 50-hour week. Now, these are the conditions that will drive workers to action. And already, as John has explained, there has been local actions. However, some of this was discussed last week, the next point. It's absolutely essential that the existing trade union movement, that the workers take on the bureaucracy, that the workers join the branches, join the organizations, and take on these parasites who have put themselves at the top of the workers' organizations. So it's not sufficient to just list how bad they are. We could do the same in Ireland, or I'm sure the British Commonwealth could do the same. The essential point is that the workers take part in the union activity and fight to change the attitudes of the leadership of the workers' organizations. It's not a matter of dual unionism, forming new unions or anything like that. It's a matter of transforming the existing unions. Now, there's a small amount of membership. The membership is around 10%. Density is 10%. But irrespective of density, nothing can prevent the workers from moving into action. Now, in thinking about this meeting, I was looking back historically, and in 1929, just around the time workers were entering the crisis in America, less than 10% were members of trade unions at that time. Yet between 1933 and 1937, there were massive strikes right across America in steel, in mining, in manufacturing. So a period that began with a low density of the trade unions changed to being a revolutionary period in American history in the mid-30s. I was then looking again at a period in the early 20s, where again there were massive strikes. Incidentally, it's worth noting that in Portland, Oregon, and a couple of other places, there were Soviets in the early 20s. Now, they didn't last very long, but the idea that they were raised at all amongst the organized American workers is significant. But anyway, in the early 20s, 1/3 of miners and 1/5 of transport manufacturing workers were unemployed. And that gave rise to a huge movement amongst the workers. There was a call in Chicago for a Labour Party. The Chicago Federation of Labour called for a Labour Party. There was an American Labour Party in New York, that was the title, founded in 1919. In Ohio and Dakota and some other places, there were calls for a Labour Party. There was then a conference called, which is very significant. A conference was called in Chicago for progressive action. And the idea was that all of this movement should be brought together to form some kind of progressive movement for the future. And that's the thing we should look at now. Now, irrespective of all this election, and we don't know how that's going to go, there has to be a coming together of all the progressive forces in American society. The trade unions is one, community groups, Black Lives Matter, other organizations, the Comrades in Seattle, wherever there's a movement towards the left, they must all be brought together to a conference in the States, the idea being to establish an organization that represents progressive movements. Now, again, when I was looking at this, we can debate these things for a long time, but nonetheless, there have been independent candidates in America. Now, elections don't solve everything, but there have been independent candidates. Not all on the left, by the way. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was an independent candidate, so was Ross Perot in more recent times, a businessman from Texas. But there was one significant development in 1924 when a guy called La Follette stood representing progressive forces in America. There was a group called the Farmer Labour Party because farm prices in cotton and so on had been falling, wheat and things like that. So the farmers combined with the labour movement to form a Farmer Labour Party and eventually became the Federated Farmer Labour Party. And when La Follette stood, now he didn't represent just that interest and he wasn't reliable, but nonetheless, when he stood, he got 17% of the vote in the election, the third highest ever secured by a progressive candidate. I don't like the expression third party, as if the two parties is inevitable. We called, if there was to be another organization, another party, it would be a socialist party or a workers' party or independent party, not a third party. That terminology is prejudicial to the outcome. Anyway, when La Follette stood, there was a big debate on the left, and the Socialist Party were reluctant about supporting him. The Communist Party was split. There was all this dispute, but nonetheless, he stood and got a good vote representing an advance for American society. Now, the reason I'm bringing these things up is because the negative features of today's society have been, as this has happened before, it's not new. And we must raise our gaze from the events that are happening at the moment. I mean, Trump is a total and utter idiot in many ways. He doesn't know how to represent the class that he was put in to represent. I mean, John is right about all of that. But he'll be gone anyway. I mean, he's not a permanent feature of American society. Black and white workers will unite, irrespective of these nutcases on the streets who are threatening a civil war. Irrespective of all of that, the workers will unite because of the objective situation. And when the election finishes, instead of waiting for 4 years to elapse and then see what turns up, we must start now to see, can we convene, can the Labour movement, not us as a group, can the Labour movement convene a conference, the purpose of which is to form a progressive left-wing workers' alternative that will stand in the future. Now, Eugene Debs obviously was a great socialist leader, and he stood for presidential for the presidency. But it's more favourable now. The conditions now are favourable to form a left-wing party in America, and he must take initiative immediately after the election to see, can we convene such a conference of progressive forces in America. And the aim, we could look at all historical precedents, there's plenty of them. The aim will be to make sure that this farce doesn't happen again, that we wait 4 years and the same old rigmarole, Republicans, Democrats, who's this and who's that, and we must get away from that and start now to build. And lots of trade unions, as John has explained in his opening contribution, have been discussing the need to take political action. So let's take political action. And this means, getting back to a point I made at the beginning, workers must make the existing unions fight. It's not sufficient to complain about them. They must join, attend, campaign, agitate and demonstrate to transform the unions that they are in. They pay money to, they fund the union. Why not make the unions represent their interest? So we have to do that as a first step and then move forward towards some kind of a progressive conference or a conference of progressive forces, such as happened previously in history. The aim of it being to bring working class and socialist politics to the fore in the discussion in America, and not to be looked at as a kind of an Ulster-Ran phenomenon like Sanders and the rest of it, Willie, won't they, you know? We must have our own organisation, and this means taking steps immediately to bring together and to rally all the left-wing and progressive forces. And just one final point with relation to the black movement. Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King, these three moved to the left and moved towards a socialist position at the end of their lives. Martin Luther King, when he spoke in Memphis when he was killed in 1969, he was addressing a meeting of municipal workers who were on strike. When he gave the famous speech in Washington about I Have a Dream, he had trade union leaders on his platform, and there was many people in the audience wearing trade union badges. So Martin Luther King was able to move left and mobilize working class interests. Malcolm X similarly began to talk about the importance of socialism, and he himself was kind of on the fringe of the Socialist Labour Party in America, and he moved to socialism. The Black Panthers, Fred Hampton, whom Carol mentioned in a discussion earlier, he was a revolutionary socialist. He was killed in his bed, actually, interestingly enough. He was shot in his bed in the same way as the woman was shot in Louisville, Kentucky. But Fred Hampton, member of the Black Panthers was moving to the left with the demands for employment, for workers' rights, for housing and so on, became part and parcel of their movement. So even in the black struggles of the past, the leadership moved to the socialist position. And that will happen again. It will happen again with the black movement today. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Finn. That was a fantastic rousing speech, I have to say. Thanks very much. Right, Temos, I think you were next to come in.
Well, first of all, I think we had a very interesting description of the situation in the United States from a point of view that is very important. And I think that this is, the whole thing is describing a situation moving towards crisis and a revolutionary atmosphere in the United States. And I tend to agree on this general estimate. I have to state that it is my principle not to profess that I know better than the people who live somewhere what is going on, and so take whatever I say with a pinch of salt. I mean, it should be. I'm talking from quite a distance from the events in the United States, and although the United States is such a country that we have quite a lot of information, it's a different thing being involved in the events themselves. The few things that I would I noted from John's description is, first of all, the fact that there is a split in the capitalist class, and I think there is, but we have, I think, to identify what does this split correspond to, what kind of split it is. And my impression is that this split comes from a much deeper crisis in capitalism, because we are not talking about sort of Adam Smith capitalism that we were talking in the previous period. I mean, what we have today is just such a perversion of capitalism that we have a few huge companies ruling the system, and they are leaving almost the whole of the rest of the capitalists in the lurch. That's why we have this split. And I think that in this situation, it's very natural to see grassroots movements springing up. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, climate change, and this sort of thing. But these also are ambivalent. They can be won by the workers, they can be won by the capitalists. I mean, we have seen the Economist exposing the heavy racial differences in the US and saying that this cannot continue. And this is the sort of thing that could win such a movement to the establishment if the establishment could give them this correction. I don't think they can give it to them. That's why I think that we are in front of very important events, and Bernie Sanders is not somebody who is there to help the capitalists win their game. He is a result of a very deep dissatisfaction, and he's expressing the impasse of the system, and that's why he's supported by the left, by the workers, and this is why it's important not to minimize his importance. Also, we see other people, other progressive Democrats speaking in a language that we haven't seen before, speaking about socialism. And all this is the result of something that is brewing in American society. So I would be, if I would be there, I would join these movements and try to build the socialist organization, not for them, but to build it in parallel with them, in cooperating with them, and giving the fight against the West in the ruling class split at the moment.
Thanks very much, Temos, for your contribution. I've got Cheryl had a hand up next, I think. Are you ready to come in, Cheryl?
Yeah, try to keep my thoughts organized here. Excuse me, this is my voice. I think I want to start by addressing what Finn said. And while I appreciate, Finn, your enthusiasm and optimism for this thing's just going to happen. This workers' movement, this formation of a workers' party, it's just going to happen. I don't think, unfortunately, it's not that simple. Again, having been president of my blue collar union, having been active in a public sector union for many years, and since I've been retired, still paying attention and being involved with different things over the years, I can't emphasize enough the degeneration of the current leadership of the union movement and the demoralization of the workers themselves. This doesn't mean that things can't change quickly, but what will it take? It will take actually actions by people like ourselves, really. And I mean, so for instance, I mean, John mentioned the fact that even people who are voting for Biden and campaigning for Biden, working class people, nobody is really enthusiastic about Biden. And I think that if he is elected, which is still a question, he and Harris are elected, all the people that are currently voting for him reluctantly are going to be very disappointed, to say the least. I mean, the mood that's been in the country, the anger, the frustration, the desire for change, the desperate need for change on so many levels will remain. And so that potential is there, but what it will take is someone who understands the need to break from the Democratic Party to actually organize that resistance and bring it together. So for instance, I mean, we've, had Zoom meetings with different people. Like we met a young man. I think John met him through his Facebook page. I don't remember. He's a member of an auto workers caucus, and he's actually in Kansas. And we had a really incredible conversation with him. It was very, very inspiring because it showed that there is a working class consciousness out there that is still rooted and is reaching out for the traditions of militancy and independence. But the thing that was, so he's, that group is an example of something that could go in the direction of a Labor Party, or again, Finn's vision of all the progressive forces coming together in the United States. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. In any case, so it was fascinating talking to him because a lot of the people, I mean, a guy that he was very close to, who was in, again, this caucus for a Democratic union. I forget the name of it. It might have been for a rank and file union. I forget, but something along those lines. Some of them are Trump supporters. He was very close to a guy who was an incredible organizer, who was a real fighter for workers' rights, including for Black workers. Even though he himself, the other guy, was a racist, he was a fighter, but yet he was a Trump supporter. These are some of the contradictions we're dealing with. I mean, one of the things that I am hopeful for about this election is that if Trump loses, and if he's actually jailed or arrested, which he should be, but we'll see what the Democrats do about that if he loses the election. It will take some of the wind, I believe it will take some of the wind out of the sails of his supporters, and including his armed supporters, which will leave an opening for, a working class movement to form. But the thing is, one of the problems with, and I'm jumping around a lot here, but so I feel like observing and really paying attention to the Black Lives Matter movement, and the fact that where it stands today is not an organization. There is not that I know of. There's the demand to defund the police has gone nowhere and has actually kind of played into Trump's hands. Some of you might have seen that. I think it was a week or so ago. Trump had a rally that was attended by mostly African Americans. I think it was in DC, who are completely opposed to defunding the police. They're Trump supporters. And he's really using that, like, we support the police. Well, I mean, that demand was not well thought out. And again, as John was talking about, the Black Lives Matter movement, for all kinds of reasons, did not develop a platform that would have unified the working class. It's, so, okay. Losing track of my thoughts here. I was talking about Black Lives Matter. I think there are many obstacles to this idea of the progressives in the United States convening. And of course, one of the biggest obstacles is the fact that, again, the progressive organizations themselves, I'll just name a couple, DSA, the progressive union leaders, they have no interest in this. This is not what they're interested in. They are so deeply embedded personally, politically, economically with the Democratic Party that they're not thinking of leaving. Oh, if only we could see an exit from the support of the Democratic Party like we've seen exiting from Trump. We're not going to see that. There's no motive for them to do that. Hold on a second here. I need to go back to my notes. Yeah, I don't know. I think so again, in terms of organizing, to be concrete again, there are many people out there who would love to see a movement develop that would be a true fighting organization for working people of all colors and genders in this country. That desire is there. How it will be, actually utilized to bring together a movement will take being honest about the role of the progressive movement and keeping people from doing that. That's what has that break. It has to happen, and people have to be honest about it. Maybe that'll be easier if Biden wins, actually. Okay, one last point, which is the vice presidential debate a couple of weeks ago with Kamala Harris and Pence. I imagine that you folks over there in the world didn't see it, but it was very revealing on several levels. One, as a woman, I loved seeing Kamala Harris, sort of chop Pence into pieces for interrupting her, etc. But it was very clear in that debate that the Democrats that the Biden camp is, they're throwing the progressives under the bus. They're not fighting in any serious. They're not fighting against the Supreme Court appointment of this total reactionary anti-reproductive rights woman, and they're not fighting for anything significant on climate change or anything like that. Their program is very, very conservative. It will be pro-business, pro-corporation. So what will happen, and absolutely they are not defenders of Black Lives Matter in a meaningful way. In any case, I've lost my train of thought. I apologize for that. I'll come back in with something more concrete. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Cheryl. Maisie, I think you had your hand up before. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I share some of the same concerns as you, Cheryl, in terms of like complacency, especially after the 2016 election. And like I'm from a sort of liberal town, and so I think I sort of was living in sort of a bubble and with my expectations. And one of my biggest concerns after the 2016 election was that, like John said, like many working class voters end up voting for Trump. And that came from like very legitimate frustrations. And, but I don't know, I think I didn't really understand the working class frustration and also their direction with it too, and why they believe that Trump's policies would be a solution to that. Sorry, I've kind of written this down. So I'm sure that like it's been discussed plenty, but I'm just concerned about like, what would it take to convince the working class who voted for Trump to like he's not the solution, and that socialism isn't a dirty word, and like that it will offer rights that working class deserves, and like why people like Bernie Sanders, like their message seem unappealing to those voters. And I don't know, maybe this question is sort of naive or something, but it's just something I've been struggling with. I don't know how that perspective can be changed, and like what will take to convince, like what's wrong with the narrative here that I don't know, how is it being presented in this country, and why is it so unappealing to those people who voted for Trump, and like why was his message more appealing? How can that narrative be changed, and how can it be presented differently? That's my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Maisie. I'm going to bring David Hempson in next.
Excuse my delay. Look, thanks for all speakers coming in, and John for highlighting some of the key contradictions which the working class is facing. I'm thinking about what the perspectives are for the states. I'm drawn back to the play which Arthur Miller wrote called The Crucible. It was published in 1953, and it was an analogy. The crucible is a container in which you can melt steel, you can melt metals and other products or you could subject them to very high temperature. And that's what we're going through right now in the States. Every single institution is being put in the crucible and being tested. The unions, the Democratic Party, Trump himself, we're going through a real shakedown of society. And de Tocqueville, you know, the classical writer, French writer on American democracy, who applauded America, the democratic revolution in America, also doubted it. He said that deep inside the idea of democracy in America, and he said no society is more dedicated to equality than America, is a deep contradiction. And the contradiction he pointed to was slavery. And the fact that there could be a tyranny of a majority, in other words, a majority as reflected through the voting procedures of the time, which would ensure a domination by an elite and not by the equality which was proclaimed. And that's exactly what we are facing now in the States. He pointed to the viability, the strength of civil society. He said no society has been able to produce so many voluntary associations. People come together in all different kinds of ways. And that he felt was the bulwark against counter-democratic trends and against what he would call tyranny. But to go back to the Crucible, the play was written about the witch hunts, which took place in Salem in the 1600s. Excuse the background of our dog. I'm sorry, I can't get out and sort him out. You know, we're finding something of a witch hunt atmosphere in America. How else can we explain what John has pointed to, which is 40% of the population still supporting Trump, despite extraordinary weakness and most extraordinary mistakes on his part? And it is again a point which I think John has made, but I'd like to deepen it, that there are conspiracies about in America. There's a feeling of a kind of a feverishness. It reminds me of colonial South Africa, the whites in colonial South Africa, the feverishness when they're faced by a challenge. They're not sure what the challenge is. The challenge is international, it's also internal. The enemy without and the enemy within. And they're determined to try and hold themselves against it, but then they turn towards every kind of conspiracy or untruth, you know, which is in the air. And there's an atmosphere which is anti-scientific, anti-reason, anti-logic, which is pointed to, you know, by a recent Time magazine. It's the most astonishing fact that this reporter went from town to town, and he found that most people that he interviewed believed in one conspiracy theory or not, and those people were determined could not be persuaded against their conspiracy theory, and most of them then didn't want to vote because they felt there was just too much confusion to make a political decision. And this is exactly what Trump has achieved. He's penetrated civil society and encouraged this ferment from below, the confusion and the despair of Americans under the crisis of capitalism, of drug addiction, of unemployment, of uncertainty about the future in every dimension. And instead of this bringing clarity, which should really develop immediately a revolutionary consciousness, there's strong belief against climate change from below, QAnon, against evolution, if you discuss this with people. And the point is not that poor people say this, this is educated people. My dentist, professional people believe in all of these conspiracy theories and do not believe in science, although they practice parts of science all the time. There's no society, in my view, internationally, which actually has this backwardness. It's a society in which there are 1.2 million girls are married underage in America. And that's with the consent of the church and their parents. So their future is completely cut off by that. And the difficulty is that, how do we explain this? It's not only the peculiarities of American colonial origins. It's also the fact that the social media have enormously accentuated this polarization. There's polarization around healthcare, Obamacare or not, around coal, renewable energy or not, around abortion, around the wearing of masks. Every one of those issues is a political statement. You're either for the right of women to be able to control their lives, their bodies, and then you're a Democrat, or you're opposed to it, and then you're a Republican. Every single aspect of society is polarized, but it's a bourgeois polarization, unfortunately. It's not a polarization around class issues. It's one step removed, and this is the danger of the situation. We see that untruths, if you deny a truth, it's 6 times more likely to appear on Facebook than if you state a truth. Just think about that. A lie circulates 6 times more than the truth. Trump's Twitter account has about 13 million followers, and Biden has just over 2 million. He's winning at the battle of lies and misinformation, or repeating untruths, and he's got many people who are prepared to do this. Now, there is also a polarization on the other side in which people are struggling to be able to clarify the issues. But this is a time in which we see that there's extraordinary issues which are raised now, as John has raised, the Supreme Court. We saw the recent candidate being put forward. She thinks that smoking could cause cancer. She believes that's true. Use the word belief. But she's not at all believing in climate change. She feels that that is a legal issue to be in dispute. It's not a scientific fact. There is, at the height of the top of society, there's a denial of scientific processes. It's not just the people who are less educated. And it's a denial of the realities of life, of democratic participation. And I think what you see is what John's pointed to is the extreme, I wouldn't say extreme, but the autonomy of politics from the economic base has gone quite far in America. The church holds a grip on the people, unlike European societies, much more than, than elsewhere, even more than in South Africa. So we do have these extraordinary weaknesses in terms of working class people understanding what their interests are. But I do not think that the enemy is within. I think we have to be clear about that. The enemy is Trump, that capitalist class, which is bearing down, on the workers right now, which is preparing right now to be able to remove women's rights over their body. And more importantly, and John, you must take this into account, is mounting a headlong attack on Obamacare. Now, John, you pointed out that Obamacare is nothing like NHS, and I agree with you. But it is a concession which the capitalist class has been forced to make and which they do not want. And Trump is promising to get rid of that and to load the Supreme Court to make sure that it happens. Now, what do ordinary working people say when they're faced by an onslaught of this kind? And the difficulty we have in arguing for a Workers' Party right now is, first of all, well, the issue is Trump. We're trying to get rid of a potential dictator, a person who wants to take autonomy of politics to the extreme and reconstitute the state, reconstitute the Republican Party is already done, but reconstitute the state, the Supreme Court, the Senate, every practice of democracy, to be able to work, on and change. And that is where people unite around a weakest possible candidate, such as Biden. It's extraordinary. As people have said, there's no enthusiasm. And yet it's Biden or Trump. It's one enemy or another enemy. Now, John has pointed out, the problem with the labor movement is that it's always, the lesser enemy. But that is a fact of life, unfortunately, and we can't deny it. So we just have to stand and fight and have our eyes wide open and explain to to our comrades, what is happening. Now, I was wanting to show or to share a picture of the of the decline of the labor movement. It's a little bit too complicated right now, but if you take from the 1920s, 20% was the figure at the time of the air controller strike, which was in 1981. And there's been a steady decline down to just about 10% at the moment. And this decline explains so much in American society. Imagine only 10% of this massive working class is actually in any way represented against the capitalist class. And we see the difficulty that we face. We have to organize the trade unions. We have to organize the unorganized. And we have to put forward and to work with people in the trade unions on a broad basis to be able to strengthen those unions, to be able to get the muscle so that the pressure can then come on the leadership. Obviously, the leadership is unchallenged if there's a pathetically small membership base. There's no challenge to them to do, to do much. So there has to be a pressure from below. And we have to see in what ways we can undertake this task and build with Black Lives Matter fighters and consider where the leadership is, to come from in the struggles that we face. And I think we do see this leadership. I mean, I've been following, Black Lives Matter, here in DC and elsewhere. And we have seen, tens of thousands of young people coming into struggle, some of them paying with their lives under the gunfire of reactionaries who are right there shooting at them. Now that does take some courage, and it does show those people are becoming experienced in struggle, unlike any trade union leader at the top, and many in the middle levels too. So with those people in the trade union movement, I do think we'll see something like the leaven, that is to say the leaven of the bread that we saw in South Africa with the Black consciousness elements moved into the trade unions in the 1970s and 80s and helped radicalize, the union base, which was being decimated because of the bannings and detentions. And we must look to that, because I don't see the other way in which we can actually build a strong working class base in America. If I could just conclude with a point in relation to clarification of the issues. We have to fight against the conspiracy theories which have been put out and help clarify. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to do so. They have an autonomy, and none of the people that I've ever discussed with who holds a conspiracy theory can ever be persuaded it's wrong. You cannot deal with this, those issues headlong. It has to be a struggle over the economic and the social demands of the people, the necessities of the people. So, to be able to put forward a clear working class program, to explain that we're for a complete transformation of the health system, that we're in favor of the rights of women to be able to exercise control over their lives, to be able to explain the necessity of democratic rule through opening up, the voters' roll so that people are not displaced from the voters' roll. We have to put forward a program of complete transformation against the monopolies, against the media, which is actually profit-based and therefore spreading lies and misinformation and confusing working people. And actually then I think in that struggle, we'll be able to clarify how we can actually move towards a workers' party. In the past, I think John has agreed that we only we'll see a workers' party emerge out of the struggle of the Black working people and Black women who are in struggle right now. And a combination of that, as we've seen in Portland and elsewhere, of white radicals and those who are moving into struggle. We have to, it's not a matter of optimism alone, although we are optimistic. It's a matter of recognizing that base and building on it. We face at the moment the mobilization of counter-revolution and its hard and its soft form. On the other hand, we see also the evidence of revolution. If there is a movement from the Proud Boys and the right wing in America, you'll also see a counter movement from below as never before. We'll see the Democrats coming to power, where Biden would be the weakest president, as has been said, but we'll also see a powerful movement below, and a movement which will be demanding jobs because we're losing jobs, an end to evictions, because that's what's being planned and that's next on the agenda, and the rights of Black men and Black women, you know, to a life in America instead of the horrific conditions under which people are existing. I think we can see that develop on the way. It's not imminent, but it may come quicker than we think. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, David. Ed, you're next.
Thanks, Pam. Well, thank you, comrades, for the points you've made, and you know, the insights you're giving us into the situation in America. I wanted to go to the question. Maisie, incidentally, has had to leave the meeting, but I wanted to still follow up her question. What would it take to convince Trump supporters that he's not the right man for the job? And I think one of the features of American society is that there's a great deal of pragmatism. What works is right. I was in Louisiana the week that Trump got inaugurated, and I was at a gig sitting next to someone who was a Trump supporter, and having a conversation with him, and he was asking me, you know, well, what do you think of Trump? And I told him, he said he liked Trump because Trump was different. He's one of us. He's worked his way up from the bottom. He knows how to be a successful businessman. He'll make America great again. Now, if that, you know, if that were true, if it were going to happen, then Trump supporters would continue to support him. But Trump actually, from a global point of view, represents the dilemma and the crisis of American capitalism. He represents the collapse of America's position as the dominant trader in the world economy in relation to the rise of China. And therefore, he represents the impasse that American society is in at the moment, particularly the American economy. I would say part of what has kept Trump supporters hanging on to Trump in this period has been the extraordinary weakness of the Democratic Party's policies. In the run-up to the 2016 election, early in the stages of that campaign, opinion polls showed that if Bernie Sanders had won the nomination for the Democrat Party, Bernie Sanders would have won the election. But if Hillary Clinton would win it, then opinion polls showed that Trump was likely to win the presidency. And the reason is because, you know, Bernie Sanders had policies that reflect the aspirations of huge numbers of working class people in America. Now, I'm quoting here from the British Capitalist Economic Journal. More people are talking about universal basic income in the USA. More people are talking about Medicare for all. The conversation has changed since 5 years ago, not because of the pandemic, but the lack of the response to the pandemic has speeded this up. There is a groundswell for ideas that would have been considered far too left even 5 years ago, and this shift to the left will keep occurring. That's not me, that's The Economist, Britain's capitalist, thinking person's capitalist journal. So we've got, and you know, I know comrades have affirmed this, that there is a groundswell of change in the mood of working class people in America, and even to the extent that some of the trade union leaders, like McLevy, have actually been calling for a general strike. I mean, you know, these are significant reflections of the change in mood amongst the working class. And I mean, that's also reflected in the fact that, as John pointed out, more than 1,000 strikes since March, initiated from below. I'd be interested to know, but if comrades can give me the information, what about the gig economy workers? You know, are there steps, are there moves, are there initiatives to get those workers organized? These things, you know, are also reflected in the movement of Black Lives Matter, which continues to struggle despite all the difficulties that it's faced. I mean, I read just the other day that 2 more statues have been bust down in Portland, Oregon. I mean, you know, this is an incredible movement that's endured despite all the hardship and all the difficulty that it's faced. So the big question that everyone in this meeting seems to be asking is, when is all this going to change from a sort of bubbling groundswell, a different mood, a new attitude? When is it going to change into concrete steps to produce an organization of the working class? And I don't think Finn was saying that it's going to be simple, but I think, you know, this is a step-by-step process, and the idea of bringing unions together, of course, you know, the role of Marxists in any situation, of course, it is to see that there are elements of counter-revolution and elements of revolution building up within the surface of any situation, underneath the undercurrents that are taking place. The role of Marxists is not just to enumerate all those different processes, but also to point to the next steps, however difficult they are. And I think Finn's contribution does help us. You know, it is a question where Marxists are working in the unions of taking initiatives to begin to bring those organizations together. And of course, if there are, I think Themos is absolutely right, if there are conversations happening in the Democrat Party amongst people who look to the Democrat Party because it's the only party on articulating left-wing ideas at the moment, then we involve ourselves in conversations with them as well, because that is the way to begin to bring this movement. You know, things can happen very suddenly and very dramatically in America. You know, sometimes decades go by and nothing much seems to happen, and particularly in a society that is very pragmatic and free of the ideologies of thousands of years of previous generations of rulers and so on. Particularly, things can suddenly speed up, and I think you know, we have got a situation in America where things are at a turning point.
Thanks very much, Ed. By rights, Roger's next, but Cheryl's got a hand up. We just wanted to say something briefly to finish off what you said before, Cheryl. Because if you are, I'll squeeze you in. Yeah? Okay.
Oh, you're squeezing me in now.
I'll squeeze you in if you just add in on to what you said before. So it's Roger's turn, really, but we might be able to squeak you in if it's not a big thing. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay. I was going to address what Maisie raised, but she's gone. But I think I'll go ahead and do it anyway, okay. Which is just, it has to do with the Trump supporters and what's going to happen with them and who they are and all that. I do think that none of us and you know, there's not going to be a one-on-one conversation with people who have rejected science and reason and all that. I do think that the diehard Trump supporters, the only way that they will become sort of return to sanity and more of a class perspective is if there's a movement that sort of drags them along. Many of those people, I mean, it goes without saying, the people who voted for Trump, It was a rejection of the policies of NAFTA, globalization, and neoliberal policies. We all know this, it's a given, but it's important to remember that always. That they didn't end up there by accident. It was a response to a destruction of their lives and their standard of living. They were desperate. What did the Democrats stand for? The Democrats stood for all the things that hurt them. So they said, let's try this asshole. He's not a politician. So in any case, that was what I was going to say to Maisie. Other last comment, which has to do with, again, it can't be overemphasized, the crises and the decline of the nation state, and that there's no capitalist party anywhere in the world that is able to stop that process. I'll end there.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. Right, Roger, off you go.
Oh, well, I think I'd start by saying that the situation in the USA appears so utterly bizarre and outlandish as to be unique. But I think really what we have to say is that it's only a grotesque exaggeration or projection of a situation which is happening throughout the what was the most developed part of the world, the accelerating decline in North America and Western Europe, and of course very markedly in Britain. It marks a historical transition. Now, the new crisis which is developing now is likely to be as bad or worse than that of the 1930s. And what happened then is, in America, we saw, been referred to already, a huge rise in trade unionism, the development of the CIO, the absolutely amazing sit-in strikes in General Motors, and so on. And as late as, in more recently, in the 1970s in Britain, we saw again wave after wave of national strikes, bringing down successive governments, culminating in the miners' strike of the mid-80s. So the first thing is, why is it that there hasn't been the same kind of response today? And I think it's the most obvious thing, but it's so obvious that people often discount it. But the fact of deindustrialization, that the old heavy battalions of the industrial proletariat have gone. Over the last 50 years throughout the West, the traditional home of industrial production, the percentage of GDP contributed by manufacturing industry has declined from 35% to just 15%. In the USA, 1/3 of manufacturing jobs have been lost since 2001. I looked up the figures just tonight before the meeting, trying to find out what's the composition of the employed population in the USA. I see that top of the list is education. Restaurants and catering come, I think, second. There's actually 4 million people in America working in the fast food sector alone. But industrial manufacture is not even in the top 10 categories on the list. So these workers are just as much workers and proletarians as, of course, as factory workers, but they're less concentrated and they're harder to organize. On a global scale, by the way, and we always say this, but I think we've constantly got to keep it in mind, that the working class has grown to an absolute majority of the world population, expanding to every continent, encompassing, of course, women, perhaps even more so than men. China has twice as many industrial workers as the entire G7 countries put together. There are 3 billion wage workers now in the world. So with their families, overwhelmingly a majority of the population. And correspondingly, what were the major players in capitalism in Western Europe and America and so on are retreating correspondingly to a marked extent, that new factions of the ruling class are elbowing their rivals aside. John quoted something that I'd said that I'd forgotten. I talked about a lumpen capitalist class or something. But I mean, I think in a way that's quite a good way of describing it. That we've now have that whereas at one time it was merchants and slave traders, and then industrialists, and then financial capital in the USA, from slave owners to commerce to industry and so on. And now you see what seems to be at least a faction jostling for power and apparently seeming for the moment to be in power, the complete outright parasites, people indulging in complete, in just outright speculation. And it's these splits at the top are always a precursor of upheavals from below. Now, talking about that phenomenon, in Britain, in some circles, it's fashionable to describe the eruption of a rash of right-wing regimes across the world as what they call creeping fascism. And I don't want to talk about that now, because just to use this opportunity to put a plug for next week's meeting, when Comrade Themos from Cyprus is going to lead off on precisely this question of the eruption of right-wing regimes around the world. But I do think that we have to keep in mind that, yes, Trump toys with racism, he plays with racism and with the right-wing militias and with sinister conspiracy theories. If you take in Britain too, the Johnson-Cummings government, if you like, is demolishing the traditions carefully built up over centuries by the British establishment in their instruments of power, by sacking the top civil servants, attacking the law courts, and even in the last couple of weeks, passing laws in Parliament, which, well, two in particular, one which decriminalises torture by soldiers in their interventions overseas, and another one which explicitly legalises crime, including murder and kidnap, by the security forces. And just incidentally, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer called on their MPs to abstain on both of these measures, and something absolutely unthinkable and shocking. Now, this idea of creeping fascism is, of course, unduly fatalistic and one-sided. It leaves out of account the unprecedented worldwide wave of uprisings across the continents today. By the way, we mention this all the time, but now, apart from Belarus, of course, we now have new ones in what I've noticed, and there's probably some I haven't even taken account of, in Kyrgyzstan, in Thailand, and in Uganda, mass uprisings. There's a sharp polarization, in other words, worldwide. And this process is also to be seen in the USA. It's only just beginning, but to come back to the point, the fact that 13 million people voted for Sanders is, in my opinion, of huge significance. I know he's no socialist. I know that in the end he betrayed the movement that he'd mobilized. But I don't agree with something that John has said in the past, that he's simply another politician in the same mold as Jesse Jackson or as McGovern and other so-called liberal Democrats in the past. Because the difference is that they didn't attack nominally the rule of the billionaires, and Sanders did. And that has, of course, as I say, he betrayed the movement, he let them down, he didn't lead anything, he had no intention of leading anything, but it's a reflection of the absolutely transformed mood in society. Recently, there were opinion polls. One was, do you support political revolution to redistribute money from the wealthiest Americans? And in that poll, over 50% voted in favor of that. And more significant still, more than 2/3 of Afro-Americans and of Hispanics, and most significant of all, of the whole generation of 18 to 29-year-olds, all voted for that, for revolution to take money off the wealthiest Americans. So a real period of radicalization has begun, as Ed pointed out. And yes, the trade union bureaucracies are conservative and, if you like, reactionary. And in Britain, by the way, trade union membership has halved since 1979. And in the USA, it's fallen, again, I just looked up the figures, from 35% in 1954 to 10.5% today. But the interesting thing is that new strata are coming into struggle. In Britain, the biggest strikes over the last few years have been those of teachers, junior hospital doctors, and university lecturers, none of which would have considered themselves exactly as the vanguard of the proletariat in Britain before. And at the other end of the spectrum, we've seen a huge wave of strikes by really at the bottom end of society, if you like, of office cleaners, of delivery couriers, of fast food workers, and so on. And in the USA too, we've had wave after wave of teacher strikes. We've had, of course, this massive uprising of Black Lives Matter involving black and white youth together. So I think surely, just as the militant CIO came in the 1930s and flooded and submerged the old conservative craft-based AFL kind of aristocracy of labour, so aren't we at the beginning, aren't we on the eve of a similar process of rebellion, of upsurge, of improvisation? Isn't that on the cards in the period ahead? And maybe a massive drive of unionisation of the previously unorganised and even apparently unorganisable. The crisis always starts at the top, and I think we just finished thinking of that. These paroxysms and these contortions of a crazed billionaire elite in America are just a foreshadowing of a coming explosion. There are millions of people now facing unemployment, homelessness, and complete destitution. Surely they will have the last word.
Thanks, Roger. Right, it's nearly 20 to 9. I have a mind to give John about 10 minutes to make his concluding remarks. Is that all right, John? You have to take your mute off, or I can't hear you. Unmute yourself. Right, while he thinks about it, we've got 2 hands up at the moment, and I think that's the only time really we've got. We can't really take any more contributions now, so I'll bring them in one at a time. If you can keep your remarks perhaps to no more than about 5 minutes, then we'll allow John to sum up and try and finish for 9 o'clock. Okay. So Felicity, would you like to come in now?
Do you have me on the list of raised hands?
Sorry?
This is the first time I've raised my hand since I've been coming to these meetings, and I just have I need 2 minutes to say what I want to say.
I can't say you really. I did call Felicity, but you go first, Irene. That's fine. Yeah. Okay.
No, I can wait.
No, you carry on now. You started. It's fine.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say, Roger, from your mouth to God's ear. I wish things would go that way. They probably will go that way. But there was something that I wanted to raise. It's the power of racism and the political landscape. I think that you know, racism has been used for 400 years to separate the working classes, all their forms, from each other. You know, the blacks from the whites, et cetera, and they from the Indians. Right now, I think it stops both the black population and the white, black working class and the white working class from seeing the question in terms of class as opposed to race. That's one of the reasons Trump has been so powerful and so attractive to the white working classes, because he expresses the worst sentiments on racism, and therefore gives them permission to do so. And in the absence of a working class movement, when there is no solution for their plight, they grasp at that fantasy that Black people are responsible for their condition. On the other hand, on the other side, you also have the Black community fighting against the conditions here. And it's very difficult to go from a consciousness of being exploited as Blacks as opposed to being exploited as workers. And a lot of people are they're not convinced. It's very difficult to get to that, because the immediate oppression is felt as a Black person, whether you're at the workplace or on the streets or in a store trying to buy something or whatever it is. The other thing is the formation of a Black middle class was a very conscious strategic strategy by the capitalist class in order to keep down the rest of the Black working class. After the civil rights movement, there was a surge of middle class folks. The middle class expanded and became a political force of sorts that really fell into the Democratic Party and pulled any aspirations of the Black working class into the Democratic Party. And in fact, when Biden was asked about his terrible policies toward the incarceration of Black young folks, Black people, Black males, he said, that my policies were voted on by the Black caucus, that they agreed with it. So the Black middle class and their institutions and their organizations have a very nefarious role in the development of the Black working class consciousness. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say.
Unmute, Pam. We can't hear you, lovely.
It's me. It's me that's forgetting now. Sorry, Felicity, it's you now.
Okay, thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I think that one that will keep us all, give us all brain food for quite some time, thinking it through. The point I'd like to make is that there's a distinction between the role of socialists and those of the class movement. Socialists don't control the waves of class struggle. The waves of class struggle come from history, economic, social movements. They arrive, and the point is whether or not we can actually make sure we're heard when the wave arrives. I'm very fond of quoting the role of the Marxists in the run-up to the wave of trade union organization at the time of Eleanor Marx and the new unions in the end of the 19th century, where they were, yes, having meetings like this, lots of discussions, lots of papers written, lots of small groups operating. But what suddenly changed it was they were heard by the unskilled workers. And the unskilled workers created a huge movement that changed the face of the labour movement in England and to an extent in Europe. So I think we need to be, I think that the work that John and Cheryl and Irene and the other American comrades have done is phenomenal. And I think that keeping the faith through the terrible times we've faced in the last 10 years has been amazing. You shouldn't beat yourself up because it hasn't as yet, shown fruit. I think there's every chance it will in the future. I think the time scale for a response from the class might be linked to this election, or it might not. If the handover of power is disputed, then I think you are in, I mean, John's written about this already, and you're in deep, deep trouble. But if you look at France, France had a choice between an open fascist, Macron, Le Pen, and Macron, who was a full-on neoliberal Thatcherite. They chose the lesser of the two evils, and then the class went up in a way it's not gone up for half a century in terms of struggle. So, I mean, the two things, voting for a reactionary doesn't automatically mean you won't go into struggle. But on the more practical issue of what do you do? I mean, I'd have thought that the the work of the nurses in America, the nurses union in America, is phenomenal. And surely some work around that nurses union might be useful for socialists to involve themselves in. I mean, they have, challenged everything and basically kept the blinking country afloat faced with the worst of the pandemic. And they've been prepared to go out on the streets and challenge the idiots as well. So I think that, you know, the work that comrades have been doing, both in spreading ideas and spreading the idea of spreading the history of the movement's really important. And maybe, I mean, you know, Leslie would probably be able to speak about this better than me, but the role of the pensioners in the trade union movement in this country is very good in being able to raise what had happened in the past, what people did, what they'd done in certain situations, and because they're not at work, being able to get out and help out on picket lines more than other people will. So, you know, working with pensioners organisations could be good, but I also think that what you're doing now is good. I don't think there should be any doubt about that. And then finally, just the issue of the level of reaction that we're facing. I put a quote from Trotsky on the chat, and it is racism and reaction has been weaponized by the ruling class as a means of controlling everything. It's happening to a horrible extent in Britain at the moment as well. So it's all, but racism's a different scale in the States, I accept that. But it also happened, and I'll finish on this, you know, that in Ireland, you had a deliberate, you know, imported group of workers who were the Orange Lodge and the unionists brought into Ireland to keep the working class in its place and split it out. And yet the wave of unionisation that took place with Connolly and Larkin unionised the Protestant and Catholics alike. So, you know, that's just a bit of, maybe there's some hope in history, but I don't think, you know, we are in uncharted territories. We can look back at history and learn from it, but you can't say that that's exactly the way it's going to happen at the moment. But I think the comrades are flexible enough in thought to be able to react and use the capital that they have in their experience and their contacts to be able to make some kind of an impact. Thank you.
Thanks, Felicity. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, that's all the contributions we've time for now. I'm going to ask John to come back in for 10 minutes so we can finish at 9. If possible, it's just a question of somebody's asked me, John, and I've pasted it in the chat, and it is, hang on, if I can get it up. Oh, I don't know if you can see it. My computer's jumping about. Can the person that's asked me to ask this question just come in and read it out? I can't quite get it out. I think it was Jimmy, wasn't it? Are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just can't quite get it up.
Just ask John if he could give a comment. During the Pence-Harris debate, Pence made a virtue out of the fact that Harris was likely, in a Biden government, that the Democrats would pack the Supreme Court with Democratic nominees to outvote the reactionary judges that have been appointed during the Trump period. How likely does John feel that that could happen, and what effect would it have either in aiding or muting the movement?
Okay, since the time is limited,
okay,
I'll just
John and me, carry on, yeah, right.
Since the time is limited, I'll just get right to it. First of all, on the issue of packing the Supreme Court, my suspicion is that, number one, Biden would, since the whole basis of his career has been working with the Republicans, I think that he would be extremely reluctant to do so. But I think that what he wants to do is hold that as kind of a trump card, as a threat to try to pressure the Supreme Court not to go as far as it's likely to go. Of course, it's not entirely in his hands, because a movement might develop from below around that issue. And the whole point that he and Harris have missed is that the Republicans have been packing not only the Supreme Court, but the entire federal court system ever since Obama was in office, by refusing to consider the appointments that Obama tried to make all up and down the federal court system. And they don't want to make that point because they don't want to go to the crisis of trying to pack the Supreme Court, or alternatively, it might have to be that they'll have to try to impeach some of the Supreme Court justices, and lying under oath before the Senate is an impeachable offense. That could be a key crisis for a Biden administration. To get back to some of the main points, I agree that the most important role of Marxists is to map out the general line of march of the movement, what conditions make it both necessary and possible to move towards, and then to be very clear and explicit on what are the next necessary and possible steps in this particular juncture. And I think maybe in my introduction, I had underestimated how long it was going to take. And so I would kind of rush through the last part and left out a lot. And maybe in my introduction, I didn't deal sufficiently with that. But if you read any of my writings in Oakland Socialist, you'll see that is one of the main things that I deal with. Also, in what I raised, in some ways, I tended to emphasize some of the difficulties, including the reactionary attitudes that a whole wide layer of the working class, especially the white working class, has taken up. And also some of the problems and shortcomings of the movement. And the reason why I tended to emphasize those was that I do feel that amongst some of my comrades in WIN, that there's a reluctance to sufficiently consider those problems. As far as what Finn was saying about calling for, just to give an example, about calling for the progressive forces to come together with the union leadership for a conference. Well, I've been trying to do that for the last couple of months, calling for the progressive forces. Don't even have so-called progressive forces. Don't even have to even have a conference. Just simply turn towards the rank and file of the unions. And you know what the response has been? Zero. There is no interest in it. That shows and this is amongst people that call themselves socialists and Marxists. There is a left ghetto whose walls are bigger and more powerful, it seems, than the wall that Trump is trying to erect along the southern border. They talk amongst themselves, and there was very little interest in dealing with a wider layer of the working class. And if I had another 2 or 3 hours, I could amplify on that a little bit. And as far as the union leadership, all wings of it, including the progressive wing, are absolutely determined to maintain their ties on the one hand with their own employers and on the other hand with the Democrats. And so therefore, and this has been my perspective for quite some time now, that I believe that a break in the situation will come when there is a semi-spontaneous uprising of the working class and other layers. Maybe some, and I've raised this many times in the past, including with WIN, maybe something similar to the Yellow Vest movement. And it will be that will provide a break in the situation. And we have to prepare for it, to try to anticipate it, amongst other things, as I've said again many times, by encouraging the rank and file of the unions to build opposition caucuses, not to, as Dave Hempson said, to pressure the union bureaucracy, but to actually fight for power within the unions and in the workplaces, including the power to shut the workplaces down. Now, was involved in trying to do that for many, many years, not only in the carpenters union, but in helping people in other unions, including grocery clerks. And it's been very, very hard going because of the tremendous alienation that the overwhelming majority of union members feel towards their own unions. My hope is that with all the turmoil and crisis that exists in society, that something may have shaken loose, and there may be the potential to do that. But the problem is I haven't found not any forces within the left that are interested in trying to do that. Incidentally, almost all of them, without exception, have links either directly or indirectly with the union bureaucracy. That's why they're not willing to do that. Now, as far as Sanders, again, the problem that I have and why I have emphasized, and I haven't said that he's just the same as Jesse Jackson. He can't be, because the present situation is very different from the 1980s. First and foremost, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But again, the problem that I have is that I've had a lot of difficulty getting the comrades to just state very clearly and explicitly, yes, we should have supported Jesse Jackson, or no, it was correct not to have. And that's why I have emphasized what his overall role has been, which has not been in any way fundamentally different from those in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party who came before him. Let me just, and again, it's not, yes, the rhetoric is all fine and good, but one of the main things, as I pointed out, is what are you advocating for the here and now? And just to give a very clear example, and incidentally, the union that really bears watching far more than the nurses is the flight attendants, who during the government shutdown a couple years ago, the president of the flight attendants union, Sarah Nelson, called for a general strike. Now, she didn't do anything beyond that, but just her calling for it publicly says a lot. Now, contrast that with the role of Bernie Sanders. What did he do? He circulated an online petition aimed at Mitch McConnell. So, if we think, and I do, that the key thing is to encourage and to anticipate and to encourage to the extent that we can an uprising from below, which I think will most likely be similar to the Yellow Vest movement, then what Bernie Sanders stands for, not only in the long term, as far as breaking from the Democratic Party, but also the immediate consequences of that. As far as mobilizing a movement from below, it is in diametric opposition to what I think socialists should be standing for. And incidentally, it's no accident that the elements of the socialist movement and those who call themselves socialists, who are most strongly tied with, most strongly supported Bernie Sanders, are the exact same elements that did absolutely nothing to try to build a movement from below. I'm thinking first and foremost of DSA, which would have been strong enough with their membership, could have actually done that. I agree about the points about anti-science hysteria, and I'm just going to skip around a little bit.
Yeah. You can start winding up, John, because
yeah, I am. And I should just note that it's not only in the United States. I not so long ago published an article from someone in Germany who explained that the same thing was happening there. And to get back to the unions, as far as organizing to build the trade unions, strengthen the unions, and so on, it is impossible to do that effectively without linking that with building an opposition and an organized opposition movement, opposition caucuses within the unions. So I agree with Irene's points about racism. So just again, the main issue is, and I'll conclude with this, the main issue is how and in what form will a spontaneous mass movement develop from below, and how we as socialists can anticipate that and try to work towards it. And what I've said, I believe that at this point, we should be turning to the rank and file of the unions to see if there's a mood to start to build an opposition that actually fights for power, not pressures the leadership, but actually fights for power within the unions. And on that basis, as a confused movement from below, such as similar to the Yellow Vest movement, starts to develop, that we can inject a more clear class element into it, leading towards the building of a national organization on a working class basis that would then start to develop into a working class political party.
That's absolutely brilliant. Thanks, John, and on time too. Thanks for leading off and for your reply. I think we've had another excellent discussion. I don't know if anybody's been watching the chat on the side, but it's certainly been heating up the last 20 minutes. So, you know, there's obviously plenty of room for debate, and we will return. I think we'll be returning to this subject again and again and again. So thanks to everybody. Are there any final announcements, Roger? You've already mentioned next week's WIN meeting. Do you need to say anything else? No, okay.